Content warning. This audiobook contains strong language, sexual themes, supernatural elements, and graphic depictions of death. The author recommends this work for audiences aged 18 and over. If you let your 6-year-old listen, that's on you. Dark Matter, The Order of the Hidden Cross, by Ian Bailey, published by Ashlar Press. Copyright 2025. Chapter 8, Flavius and Caius. The torches burned low, sputtering softly as seconds dragged into minutes, which dragged into hours. Each flicker of the flame cast jagged shadows that danced along the cold stone walls, twisting into shapes that seemed alive. Flavius shifted uneasily, his weight moving from one foot to the other, trying to shake the deep chill that had seeped into his bones. A steady drip echoed somewhere above in the chamber dome, a haunting rhythm that only deepened the oppressive silence. Caius sat slouched against the wall, his back turned to the iron door they were tasked with guarding. His posture was deceptively relaxed, knees bent, arms draped loosely over them. His half-closed eyes betrayed nothing, but Flavius could see the tension in the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers flexed every so often. The silence gnawed at Flavius. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty corridor. It was heavier, almost sentient. The shadows around them didn't merely shift. They seemed to pulse as though they were breathing. He cleared his throat, trying to dispel the weight in his chest. "How much longer?" he muttered, his voice cracking. He hadn't meant to sound so nervous. It was supposed to be a routine shift, but nothing about this night felt routine. Caius didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed on a point in the darkness. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, "Until we're relieved." Just like always, his tone was clipped, irritated. "What did you expect? A miracle?" Flavius glanced at the iron door, its surface covered in a faint layer of frost. Beyond it lay the prisoner, a being cloaked in shadow and legend. "It's different tonight," he said, hesitating. "Don't you feel it?" Caius's eyes snapped fully open, pinning Flavius in place. "Feel what?" His voice was sharp, but Flavius caught the edge of something beneath it. "Fear. You're letting this place get to you." "Don't start." "I'm not imagining it," Flavius said, more firmly this time. He gestured toward the door, though his hand trembled slightly. "There's movement, and I swear I heard whispers." Caius froze, his knuckles tightening on his knees. His expression hardened, but the flicker of fear was unmistakable now. "Do not speak of the whispers," he hissed. His voice dropped to a near growl. "First whispers, then screams. And when you hear the screams, they drag you away. No explanations. You don't come back." Flavius's stomach knotted. "But if there's—" "No!" Caius snapped, cutting him off. He straightened, his voice sharp as a blade. "You're not the first to hear them, Flavius. It's this place, it gets inside your head. Just do your duty and keep your mouth shut." The iron door rattled. Both men froze. The sound wasn't loud, but in the heavy silence, it was deafening. Flavius's heart slammed against his ribs as the metal groaned, the hinges straining under some unseen pressure. His hand flew to the hilt of his blade, though it felt useless in the face of whatever might be beyond that door. "Did you hear that?" Flavius whispered, his voice barely audible. Caius didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the door, his body unnaturally still. Then, with forced calm, he muttered, "It's just the hinges. Old iron. It shifts." The door rattled again, followed by a soft, rhythmic scratching. Flavius's breath hitched. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging across stone. It sent a shiver down his spine. "Caius," Flavius said, his voice trembling. "What if—" "Don't," Caius growled, cutting him off again. He stood, his movements stiff, deliberate. "Don't go near it." Flavius took a half-step forward, his instincts warring with his fear. But what if— "I said no!" Caius's hand shot out, gripping Flavius's arm like a vice. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, now they were wide with something Flavius hadn't seen before. Panic. The scratching stopped. For a moment the silence was even worse. The air felt heavier, pressing down on them like a burden. Flavius opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. Then came the voice. "Help! Me!" It wasn't a whisper, nor a scream. It was a plea, soft, broken, and filled with desperation. It came from beyond the iron door, but it felt as though it wrapped around Flavius, seeping into his very soul. Flavius staggered back, his blade slipping slightly in his trembling grip. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Caius's face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't answer. Instead, he yanked Flavius back, shoving him against the wall. His grip was iron, his voice low and furious. "You didn't hear anything. Do you understand me? You didn't hear it." "But," Flavius started, but Caius's grip tightened, cutting him off. "Do you understand?" Caius's eyes burned with urgency, his voice trembling now. "You heard nothing. You say nothing." Flavius nodded, though the voice still echoed in his mind. "Help me." The words clung to him, refusing to fade. His throat was dry, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the terror in Caius's eyes stopped him. Caius released him and turned his back to the door, his shoulders tense. "We guard. That's all we do. We don't listen to voices. We don't ask questions. That's the rule." Flavius nodded again, his hands shaking as he sheathed his blade. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. He stared at the door, the shadows around it rippling as though alive. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew better. The scratching didn't return. The voice didn't speak again. But the plea lingered, echoing in his bones. "Help me." It was more than a cry for help. It was a promise, a warning. Something was inside that cell, and it wasn't done reaching out. Chapter 9. The Voice. Joshua sat cross-legged at the edge of the riverbank, the moonlight casting long silver beams across the flowing water. Shadows swirled and twisted around him like living ink, pulled toward him as if drawn by a magnetic force. Beside him, barely visible in the low light, was Beris, a 4-inch tall figure whose very existence flickered between worlds. When he was still, he looked like an intricately carved doll, but in motion he flowed like the shadows he traveled through. A small creature embedded in the dark matter, constantly phasing in and out of visibility. It had taken months for Joshua to finally convince Beris to show him how to perform this ritual, the one that would allow him to hear everything within the dark matter, the one that promised to unveil secrets hidden in the deepest crevices of reality. At first, Beris had warned him, his tiny voice tinged with urgency, telling him about the dangers of trying to peer too far into the shadows, into the dark matter, of pulling at threads that should be left untouched. But Joshua's fascination was unrelenting. Now, as Beris hovered by the young boy's side, his body glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light, Joshua could feel Beris's excitement mingling with an edge of fear. "Okay, kid," Beris whispered, trying to keep his voice steady, though it wavered like a thin branch in a storm. "Last chance to back out. You sure you remember how to start this? Or do you need a cheat sheet?" He perched on a rock, leaning over Joshua's shoulder, the tips of his tiny fingers tracing the air above the glyphs drawn in the dirt. The glyphs were different from the others they had used, more intricate, more alive. They pulsed with a faint, throbbing blue, a blue that didn't just reflect earthly light but seemed to consume it, drawing all warmth and color into its depths. It was like staring into the eye of a storm that hungered for more. Joshua nodded, acknowledging Beris's question, his eyes narrowing onto the symbols marked out on the ground, each one sharp and precise. Every breath felt labored, as if he were pulling in the weight of the shadows themselves. A bead of sweat ran down his face, not from exertion but from the electric tension in the air. He took a deep breath and, with trembling fingers, reached for the small silver dagger beside him. Its blade already reflected the eerie light of the glyphs. Beris leaned closer, his whole body tense as a coiled spring. "Just remember," he muttered, his voice dropping to a near whisper as if the night itself might be eavesdropping. "This isn't like the other rituals. You're not just tapping into some local shadow magic here. You're listening in on, well, everything." He paused, his small face tightening as he cast a wary glance at the shadows that began to thicken around them, like black silk threads weaving an ever tighter cocoon. "I've never gone this deep." "Not really. You could hear things you're not ready for. And let's be real, you're probably not ready for any of this." Joshua's heart hammered in his chest, a rhythm that matched the pulsing glyphs at his feet. He understood what Beris meant. This ritual wasn't just forbidden. It was a doorway into the unknown, a plunge into shadows no one was meant to touch. And for the first time, the intent wasn't just to see what was possible, it was to draw power into himself, to bridge a gap between realms. Beris had only mentioned it once in passing, calling it stupidly reckless. And Joshua, of course, had to do it. "Different is good," Joshua said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Without hesitation and in one swift motion, he sliced his palm open, letting warm blood flow freely over the earth. The glyphs seemed to come alive at once, greedily drinking in the offering. The blue glow morphed to a deep, throbbing crimson, like the veins of an ancient creature coming to life. The world shuddered. The shadows around him didn't just gather, they convulsed like angry serpents, wrapping themselves around his body, tightening as if trying to draw out more from him, more blood, more energy, more everything. Beris's face twisted into a nervous grin, his tiny eyes wide. "Yep, totally normal. Nothing to see here, just a kid bleeding on ancient runes and awakening the who knows what." He paused for a moment and shook his head in disbelief. "And in case you were wondering, Joshua, no, I don't have a clue how to put this genie back in its bottle. So, let's just hope this works out for the best." But beneath the sarcasm was genuine terror. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the darkness to reach out and pluck him away at any moment. Joshua ignored Beris's attempts at humor. He knew his friend well enough to recognize that jokes meant danger. But tonight, nothing could sway him. He could already feel the shadows closing in, their touch cold and familiar, like he'd felt them 1,000 times before. But they weren't what he sought. Deeper than them, deeper than the black tendrils curling around his limbs and tugging at his mind, was something else. The voice. The ritual circle pulsed with life. The glyphs seemed to writhe under his touch, their lines twisting and shifting as though alive, drinking deeply of his blood with insatiable thirst. They created a lattice of light and shadow that hovered just above the ground. The crimson glow bathed Joshua's face in an otherworldly light, and for a moment he thought he could see faces swirling within it. Distorted, wailing faces, mouths open in silent screams. But he couldn't let them distract him. He had to focus. He had to find the voice that lurked beyond all this madness, calling to him in dreams and rituals like a half-remembered song. "Joshua, I don't like this." Beris's voice was small, a rare tremor in its usual steadiness. It feels like we're being watched, and not the friendly, I'll wave to you from across the street kind of watch. More like dinner," Joshua continued chanting the words Beris had taught him, ancient phrases, dense and heavy, each syllable dragging the world around him deeper into shadow. The earth trembled beneath him, a low rumbling like the growl of a beast just waking up. The shadows tightened, their tendrils curling around his throat and limbs like vines growing at an impossible speed. He felt the whispers merging into his thoughts, promising power, strength, and visions no human eyes had ever seen. But he brushed them aside. They were just noise, distractions. The voice was what mattered. That's all that really mattered. The shadows surged, coiling tighter like a storm gathering strength, their movements liquid yet alive, each tendril dripping with an unnatural hunger. They slithered over his skin, their movements serpentine and deliberate, coiling around his arms like sentient vines, each touch colder than the last. At first, their touch was just a chill, a coldness that seeped into his skin. But as they tightened their grip, the cold grew sharp, biting like stinging nettles digging into his flesh. Joshua felt them wrap around his throat, squeezing, and he struggled for air, each breath harder to take than the last. It was as if the shadows were filling his lungs, weighing them down, and the more he breathed, the deeper they reached. The smell hit him next, thick and rotten, like the decay of something long dead and buried. It hung in the air, clogging his senses and turning every breath into a struggle. Joshua gagged, bile rising in his throat as the fetid stench clawed its way into his nose. The air tasted metallic, like copper or iron, each breath leaving a rusty tang on his tongue that made his mouth water with nausea. He could feel it at the back of his throat, a sharpness that scratched as he inhaled, as if he were sucking in shards of metal. Suddenly his skin felt raw, as if the darkness were scraping at his very bones. The pressure of the shadows became overwhelming, like heavy chains pulling him down, the weight growing unbearable. Panic flashed in his eyes, and he tried to shake them off, but the shadows only tightened in response, digging into his flesh like talons. They burrowed into him, seeming to slither beneath the surface of his skin, probing deeper, seeking to tear something out of him that lay hidden deep inside. Joshua's vision swam, spots of black and red dancing before his eyes. The whispers grew louder, no longer gentle promises but furious, jagged demands that ripped through his mind like serrated blades. He felt the tendrils slither over his face, oily and wet, wrapping around his eyes, pressing down, trying to blind him. He clawed at them desperately, his fingers sinking into their slimy, writhing forms, but it was like tearing at a swarm of slick, living worms. The shadows tightened in triumph, their darkness growing heavier and more suffocating, a crushing tide that surged up to drag him under. He choked on the taste of rot, his stomach turning as the stench of decay thickened, and the world around him spiraled into a nightmarish blackness. Then it came, a faint murmur threading through the chaos, soft yet undeniable. The voice carried the weight of desperation, raw and broken, each syllable like a shard of glass slicing through the darkness. Each word seemed to pulse with agony, yet it was familiar to him, like a dream that wouldn't leave him, like something buried deep within his very bones. "Joshua," the voice whispered, broken and raw, and Joshua's heart stuttered. It was the voice that had haunted every ritual, every shadow-drenched night. He could almost see the man behind the voice, gaunt with eyes that burned like coals, chained in darkness somewhere far away, somewhere he couldn't reach. And yet he was certain he knew the man. He just didn't know how. Joshua leaned into the voice, pushing deeper into the shadows that clawed at him, hoping to hear more, to see more. "Who are you?" he whispered, though it felt like screaming into an abyss. "Where are you?" Beris's form flickered, his terror snapping into full-blown panic as he phased in and out of view, struggling to maintain his shape against the overwhelming tide of power. "Joshua, listen to me," he shouted, though his tiny voice was nearly swallowed by the roaring shadows. Joshua, whatever you think you're hearing, it's not worth this, Beris hissed, his tiny hands gripping at the fabric of Joshua's sleeve. You're meddling with things that don't care if they destroy you. Break the circle, now. Joshua's vision was filled with darkness, writhing and twisting in on itself, growing deeper and colder as he pushed further in. The shadows began to change, their whispers turning from seductive promises to guttural threats. The tendrils tightened around his limbs and throat, squeezing, pulling, trying to drag him into their depths. He could feel their cold, oily touch seeping into his skin, filling his lungs, threatening to drown him. "Damn it, Joshua!" Beris cried, trying to climb Joshua's sleeve to pull him away from the shadows with all his strength, small but fiercely determined. "This isn't some game. I can't protect you from this." His tiny voice broke, caught between anger and desperation. "Don't let them take you like they did your father." And yet, through all of it, the voice persisted, a beacon calling to him, pulling him across the divide. Joshua could almost feel the chains around the man's wrists, could almost touch the cold stone walls of his prison beneath the ground, somewhere deep in the earth. He felt like he could pull the man toward him and rip him from the darkness. The darkness clawed at Joshua, closing in like a tomb, yet somewhere in the roiling depths of his mind, beneath the whispers, the sickening stench of decay and the metallic taste that clung to his tongue, something broke through. A moment of clarity, thin as a thread, cut through the oppressive noise. He latched onto it, focusing with all his might, and the world around him, the shadows constricting his limbs, the howling voices, faded to a distant hum. Beris's frantic voice became an echo, barely discernible, like a tiny bell ringing in an endless void. "Joshua! Joshua! For the love of the gods, stop!" But the sound felt miles away, disconnected from Joshua's mind and body. With a final surge of will, he broke free, not physically but mentally, pushing himself deeper into the dark, beyond the shadows that consumed him, beyond the voices that taunted him, beyond everything, until he was no longer in his body but somewhere else entirely. He was suddenly transported to a place deeper than any shadow he'd ever known, a realm so black, so silent, that even the spirits seemed to fear treading there. Joshua stood in the dark matter, in its deepest heart, a place beyond the reach of time and light. The ground beneath him was cold and smooth, the texture of polished stone, yet somehow endless, disappearing into the void. He looked around but saw nothing, no walls, no sky, no horizon, only pure, impenetrable black. It was as if the darkness was alive, watching him, swallowing everything he was. And then he saw it, a single piece of furniture against the endless void with an unnatural glow, like a lamp floating next to it to illuminate its presence. A wingback chair, large and imposing, made of dark leather so deeply black it blended into the shadows. It seemed to swallow his small frame as he took his place in it, drawn to it like a moth to flame. He felt himself sinking into the chair, its cold leather wrapping around him, cradling him as though it were sentient. But the real presence in the room was not the chair. It was the man who suddenly appeared sitting across from him, whom he only saw once he sat down. The figure was tall, his features half hidden by the shadows that seemed to drape around him like a cloak. There was something ancient in his bearing, something far more powerful than any force Joshua had felt before. Though the man was still, a pulsing energy radiated from him like a storm trapped within human form. His eyes were sharp, piercing through the darkness, burning with a light that felt like truth itself. Joshua could not look away, and he realized in that moment that they were not strangers. They had met before, maybe in dreams, maybe across lifetimes. But there was a familiarity, an unspoken connection, that bound them across the endless dark. They exchanged no words. They didn't need to. They spoke through the eyes, through a knowing, conversing in thoughts more profound than language, deeper than sound. Joshua's heart raced, and in that silence they shared something profound, a mutual understanding that he could not yet comprehend. But there was a sense of destiny, of purpose that grew between them like a flame being kindled in the pitch-black dark. After a long pause, Joshua's voice finally broke the silence, quiet yet strong. "Who are you?" The man's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile, and when he spoke, his voice was like a whisper that had traveled through 1,000 lifetimes to reach this point. "My name," he said, his eyes steady on Joshua's, "is Yehoshua." And with that name the world seemed to ripple, the very fabric of reality bending around the sound. "I need you to stay focused, Joshua," Yehoshua continued, his voice calm yet filled with an urgency that Joshua felt deep in his bones. "I chose you long ago to complete a task for me. I caused your existence because I have a plan, and I need your help." Joshua felt his breath catch in his throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the gravity of 1,000 worlds. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He was ensnared by Yehoshua's gaze, pulled into the depths of his eyes, which seemed to reflect all of creation. "What do you need me to do?" Joshua finally whispered. Yehoshua's gaze softened, a sad understanding in his eyes, as if he could see both the burden he was placing on Joshua and the path that lay before him. "You must deliver a message," Yehoshua said, his voice low and urgent, "to a priest named Bussi. He holds the key to my freedom, though he doesn't know it yet. I am imprisoned, trapped beneath layers of stone and magic. But my chains are spread across the multiverse, and somewhere Bussi holds the key to freeing me." Joshua's brow furrowed in confusion. "But how do I find him? Which Bussi do I need? What world is he in?" Yehoshua's face darkened with something like regret. "I do not know. I cannot see clearly enough to tell you that. The multiverse is endless, and the shadows have blinded me," Yehoshua admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "You'll need to cross worlds and unravel timelines until you find him, the one Bussi who can set me free." Joshua nodded, the enormity of the task settling on his shoulders, the fear and excitement merging into a dizzying storm in his chest. He could feel Yehoshua's strength pouring into him, filling him with a sense of purpose, a calling. "But how will I know?" Joshua asked, his voice small. "How will I know which version of him is the right one?" Yehoshua leaned back, the shadows shifting around him, and though his voice remained steady, there was a flicker of something beneath the surface, a glimpse of the pain, the desperation that drove him. "You will know, Joshua. You have my blood in your veins, my purpose in your soul. You will feel it, like a compass, pointing home." Joshua tried to hold on to the moment, to grasp the clarity that Yehoshua was offering him, but it was like clutching water, slipping away even as he tried to hold on. He opened his mouth to ask another question, to dive deeper into the truth he could feel on the edge of his understanding. But suddenly, Yehoshua's form began to flicker, his edges dissolving into the dark. "Wait," Joshua called out, leaning forward, reaching for Yehoshua, for the truth he felt slipping away. But then, through the chaos, another voice, a familiar, desperate voice, broke through like a blade of light cutting through the dark. "Joshua!" Zivah's voice, raw with terror, cut through the shadows, shattering the trance. She stood on the edge of the ritual circle, her hand outstretched, but held back as if by an invisible force. "Joshua, listen to me. You have to stop this." Joshua's eyes snapped open, the trance fracturing. "Mum?" His voice cracked. And in that instant, the glyphs exploded into a whirlwind of sparks and smoke. The lattice of light and shadow disintegrated, and the roar of the ritual was swallowed by the rushing river, leaving Joshua gasping on the ground, the world suddenly too bright and real. "I can't just stop," Joshua said, his voice trembling. I need to know who I am, what I'm meant to do. And if I don't explore this, if I don't try, then I'll never know, will I? Beris, regaining some composure, hovered beside them, his expression unreadable. He's got a point, Beris said softly. Every gifted one has to test their limits eventually. Better now than later, when he's not ready. Limits, Zivah snapped, turning her furious eyes on Beris. And who's going to teach him those limits? You? The one who's already pushed him so far into this mess that he nearly— She stopped, fighting back a sob. I trusted you to protect him, not lead him into whatever this is. Beris sighed, looking away, and for once he seemed to have no retort. Look, Zivah, he said finally, his voice softer. I never wanted to hurt him. I want him to be ready for what's coming. And what's coming? Zivah whispered, holding Joshua tighter, her voice shaking with desperation. What could possibly be worth this? Worth risking him? Beris's face darkened, and he glanced at Joshua, who could still feel the phantom of the shadows wrapping around him. More than either of you know, Beris muttered. More than you can see right now. Zivah rushed forward, grabbing Joshua's arms, searching his face frantically. What were you doing? She demanded, her voice trembling with both fury and fear. She tore a strip from her sleeve to bandage his bleeding hand. What did you think you were doing? You're too young for this. It's too dangerous. Joshua met her gaze, his eyes still unfocused. The world felt distant, dreamlike. He could still hear the voice faint and fading. But there, I had to hear him, he whispered. I had to find him. Zivah's eyes filled with tears as she held him close, her fingers gripping his arms like anchors. I lost your father to this darkness, Zivah choked out, her voice fraying with fear and fury. I won't lose you too. You have to promise me, Joshua. Promise me you'll stop before it's too late. Joshua nodded, though the weight of the promise meant little to him. Because beneath the river's current and the soft rustling of leaves, he could still hear the voice calling to him from the shadows, begging him to return. Somewhere deep beneath layers of stone and magic, a man was waiting for him. And Joshua, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, couldn't help but listen. As they walked away from the riverbank, the shadows began to recede, sliding back into the earth like oil sinking into the soil. The glyphs faded into the night, their glow extinguished, but the darkness they left behind hung thick and heavy, like a promise unspoken, a whisper that some things, once heard, cannot so easily be forgotten. In the distance, where the river's silver sheen met the darkened trees, Beris dissolved into shadow, leaving only a faint ripple in the air, as though he had never been there at all. Just before the silence swallowed the night whole, Joshua heard it. A whisper, faint yet unyielding, calling to him from the edges of existence. Promising secrets, promising strength, promising more. This chapter may have ended, but the story doesn't. Return next Monday for what waits in the dark. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment to share what the shadows may have whispered to you.